Hello, good evening, dear friends. This is Paul Lennon in the latest episode of my life before, during, and after the Legion of Christ. An Ivan sentimental Dubliner in the Legion of Christ. This is post Legionaries of Christ, thriving after the Legion of Christ, still in the transitional phase to here. And it is chapter 13 called Reviewing. Uh, as you remember, each chapter in the book begins with an R, so it has to be an R word, and this is reviewing, and it's going to review my correspondence with Father Maciel as I leave the Legion of Christ. All right, so the main idea will be that uh, that after leaving the Legion, I'll be vying with Father Maciel or struggling with Father Maciel to a certain degree because I am reclaiming my power after being disempowered for 23 years and now in the process of leaving and uh, and distancing myself from the Legion. I've already talked about leaving the priesthood, which was not the first thing that happened. The first stage was basically leaving the Legion, and this happened during my 4 years in Washington, D.C. I was in the Diocese of Washington. I kind of had a foothold in there, and um, and so I felt safe to a certain degree. I didn't depend any longer on the Legion, but I'm still separating. I want to separate from the Legion, and I want to. I'm kind of looking to engage in a struggle, in a tug of war with Father Maciel, and as a kind of a self-empowerment idea. That's the way. That's what I did. So. A tug of war, you might say, and through correspondence with Father Maciel, letter writing. And of course, I wrote to him in Spanish and he replied in Spanish, but I translated most of the letters into English for the book. Now, many chapters in the book start with a quote from Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. And this one is a pretty good one. This is very suitable to the story. Um, Siddhartha is transitioning now. I think he's leaving the samanas and now he's going into the world. All right. And as he goes into the world, and like for example, he starts working, he's no longer a monk, a samana, he starts working, and he encounters this very beautiful and attractive woman called Kamala. Uh, And I'm using the metaphor. It just occurred to me that Kamala is like the Legion. She is very attractive. Uh, Siddhartha falls under her spell, which is something I mentioned at the very beginning of my story, kind of being enchanted by the Legion, as we can be enchanted by any group, um, even if it is a harmful group, but at the beginning it may be very, very attractive and may seem to fill many of our needs. So, and also, of course, in human relationships too, we can also uh, fall under the spell of a woman if we are heterosexual and be bewitched by her. But it doesn't always end well, as you know. You've read many novels. But this is what Hermann Hesse says. Your poetry is very good, said Kamala. If I were rich, I would give you money for it. I also know the sacrificial songs, said Siddhartha, but I will not sing them any more. I also know incantations, but I will not pronounce them any more. I have read the scriptures. Talking. He's interrupted. At that moment, a servant entered and whispered something into his mistress's ear. I have a visitor, says Kamala. Hurry and disappear, Siddhartha. Nobody must see you here. However, she ordered the servant to give the holy Brahmin a white gown. Without quite knowing what was happening, Siddhartha was led away by the servant, conducted to a circuitous route to the garden house, conducted by a circuitous route to the garden house, presented with a gown, let into the thicket, and expressly instructed to leave the grove unseen as quickly as possible. Now, this is just occurring to me as I speak. Wow, I think I'm inspired that this is very often the way we left the Legion, or many people have left the Legion. It's kind of serendipitous. Contentedly, he did what he was told. Accustomed to the forest, he made his way silently out of the grove and over the hedge. Contentedly, he returned to the town, carrying his rolled-up gown under his arm. He stood at the door of an inn where travelers met and silently begged for food and silently accepted a piece of rice cake. This is what he would have done as a monk. Perhaps tomorrow, he thought, I will not need to beg for food. He was suddenly overwhelmed with a feeling of pride. He was a samana no longer. It was no longer fitting that he should beg. He gave the rice cake to a dog and remained without food. That's where it leads me to bargaining and power struggle with Father Maciel, a tug of war. Nuestro Padre, as we called him, our Father, our dear Father, it could mean. So we engage in a power struggle with Father Maciel. After I burst out of the Legion at the end of 1984, I was able, in spite of a veritable mental breakdown, to take advice from an ex-Legion colleague or colleagues. I was to send a letter to Father Maciel notifying him that I wanted to leave the Legion. So this is my friends are helping me to follow the proper steps, you might say the canonical steps for leaving the Legion. And that would entail writing to the Superior General and telling him about my wish to leave the community. This way, I would not be simply running away without permission, but starting a process acceptable to church authorities. My friends told me to sound strong and at the same time respectful, though at that moment I felt neither. I had to pluck up courage, make a staunch heart out of quivering guts, as we say in Spanish. I have been able to preserve some letters from Father Maciel because I was then safely outside. Out. I do not know what happened to the 10 or so I had received during my time in the Legion. During my time in the Legion, I had written to Father Maciel on a consistent basis and occasionally had received a letter from him. I said I think I had 10 letters from Nuestro Padre from my 23 years in the Legion. So I might have written to him every month or every 2 or 3 months. And he would occasionally answer. I later learned that, of course, he did not necessarily write these personally or in his own handwriting, but had his secretaries write these letters. But I was very proud. It was kind of like a badge of pride, of honor to have received letters from Nuestro Padre. I did not receive many. I'm sure maybe there was a kind of what would we call there, a kind of a competition between us, among us, a certain competitiveness there to see who had received more letters from Nuestro Padre, because that was a real privilege to receive them from the founder and holy man, which he was to the vast majority of legionaries at that particular time, up to that time. I was quite disenchanted with Father Maciel for my own personal reasons, but that didn't mean that he was still very beloved and almost adored in the Legion. And I had my letters and I was allowed to keep them, or if I wasn't allowed to do so, I probably hid them and kept them. Because some of my comforters have said that when you left the house or you were thinking of leaving, the superiors might go into your room surreptitiously, secretly, and take the letters from you. These little things, that are not nice. So my first letter to Father Maciel, I wrote from Bacalar. I was still on the mission, so this was soon after my breakup with Father Maciel. I think that was like October, November, and now in December. So I got advice to Father Maciel, General Director, Legionnaires of Christ in Rome. Esteemed Father in Christ, a series of problems, personal and relating to my superiors, plus my lack of trust and my inability to cope, have led me. So I'm going to take some of the blame. I'm not going to be blaming everybody. I have to humbly accept my shortcomings. Led me to a state of frustration, anger, aggressivity, and depression, producing in me insomnia and neuralgias over the past few months. This makes fulfilling my commitments to as a religious in the Legion very difficult and forces me to be honest and ask you for a leave of absence. Thus, according to Canon Law 681, Section 1, 686, Section 1, I am asking you, as Superior General, permission to leave the religious life for 3 years so as to recover my peace of soul and be in a better condition to freely and joyfully assume the obligations of my Christian, priestly, and religious life. I have the consent of the ordinary bishop of the place where I plan to reside. You have to be, as I was explained, there's no such thing as a free roaming Catholic priest. We don't do that. Doesn't exist for a Catholic priest. He either has to be under the supervision of his religious superior, or he cannot be a roving cleric, or I forget what they call them, a wandering cleric, which happened during the Middle Ages, and it was called that clericus vagus. You know, a clergyman with no fixed abode was not allowed. So, a religious superior or a bishop, which in canonical terms is called the ordinary, the man in charge of them. I have the consent of the ordinary bishop of the place where I plan to reside, so I'm not giving anything away. I'm not even saying where I am. Grateful for all you have done for me up to now, and hoping to count on your fatherly support. Yours sincerely, humbly, Paul Lennon, the Legion of Christ. That's enough for now. The next exciting chapter will continue after a couple of days. Be well and stay safe. Greetings and respect and affection from Guatemala.